Born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and I have lived all over the place, including Alabama, Northern California, Tucson, Arizona, Quito, Ecuador, Costa Rica. I moved here in August of 2002. I started my journalism career right in there, in Marin Hall, back when there was still a good bit of asbestos in the building, which was pretty awesome. I worked here for about 14 months, took an internship at the end of 2003 at the Albuquerque Journal, which quickly turned into a full-time job. I started there as the night police reporter at the end of 2003. We can talk some more about the evolution of my beat maybe in a minute, but I'll sort of go through the bio first. That's cool. I was at the Journal for 10 years and 2 months. I left at the end of September of 2013, which means that I've been gone from the paper now as long as I was there, which is a really crazy thing to think about. So I left the paper with a mortgage, no money in the bank, and no job at the end of 2013, which was a kind of crazy thing to do, but I had sort of had enough. I freelanced for a short period of time and then went to work at KRQE Channel 13, first as a contractor, a freelancer, and then as an investigations producer and reporter, supervising a team of 3 other reporters, and trying to do a little bit of commercial TV, which suited me for a year, but not for the second year. So I left there with a mortgage, no money in the bank, and no job. And then I went to work. One of my best friends, Laura Pascas, who is the environment climate change reporter at New Mexico PBS. She and I talked our way into going to work for an old friend named Jeff Jennings, who runs a nonprofit investigative site called New Mexico in Depth. I went there to write about the criminal legal system, which has been most of the focus of my career. And Laura came to write about water and climate change and stuff like that. She stayed for a year because the money was bad. I stayed for many years because I'm a masochist. I think I was in New Mexico in Depth for 5.5 years. And around 2017 or so, I went to work as a contributing editor at the Santa Fe Reporter, which is the weekly newspaper in the capital. I turned that into a half-time job at some point. So for a couple of years, I split my time between the Santa Fe Reporter and New Mexico in Depth. I left my job at New Mexico in Depth sort of a couple of months into the pandemic and became the full-time news editor at the Reporter, where I stayed for about 3 years. I left at the beginning of March of this year to take a job as executive producer for public affairs at New Mexico PBS. So I've had that job now for about 5 months. That's the bio.
And what are you doing at New Mexico?
Well, the job title is executive producer for news and public affairs, which is very fancy and very long and kind of a mouthful. They gave me an office, which is my first office in a 21-year journalism career. Pretty awesome. My primary responsibility is our Friday evening public affairs program, which is called New Mexico in Focus. It airs Friday nights at 7 and again on Sunday mornings. I wouldn't imagine any of you watch that because most folks your age and my age, frankly, are not at home watching television on Friday nights at 7. Yeah, thanks. Public programs is also a podcast. We have a podcast, yeah, which is kind of right now it's a little bit of a rehash of the show. We're doing some stuff to mess around with the podcast. I'm going to apologize in advance. I tend to swear like a drunken sailor on shore leave, so if that happens, I'm sorry to anybody. I just can't help it sometimes. Anyway, yeah, so that show is my primary gig, and we're messing with the format now, but really it's a news analysis show. I don't have a team full of reporters who are out beating the bushes and gathering original stories, although Laura does her own original reporting. So I'm sort of responsible for producing her part of the show, which is called Our Land, which some of you might follow Laura on Instagram. She has an awesome Instagram account, and also a really awesome newsletter. And so that's sort of the joy of my job. She's been one of my best friends for a really long time. And it's very cool for us to get to work together again. And then the rest of the show is we sort of pay attention to not just what's happening in the news, but also the issues that we think are important to New Mexico and not just to the demographic that we serve. Primarily the folks who watch our show are 63-year-old rich white liberal women who live in Santa Fe, which I am trying to change. I want them to watch the show too, but I think that in particular, because it's public broadcasting, it belongs to everyone. In part, those of you who pay taxes here pay a little bit for what we do. So that's kind of the primary gig. We do a lot of like one-on-one interviews, in-depth interviews. We do sort of panel style discussions around a weirdly shaped guitar pick shaped table in our studio. We do some field work. We're very different from commercial television in that, you know, if you sit down and interview someone for 15 or 20 minutes, commercial TV viewers will see, you know, maybe 50 seconds of that. I get to show people the whole of what folks said in the context of our interviews. I do a few other things there too. I do some sort of events, other kind of public affairs work. We partner with a bunch of nonprofits to do things like make election focused public service announcements. I supervise a handful of people, which is weird for me. And I also do a lot of sort of fundraising and grant writing to make sure that I can pay for the journalism we make. But like I said, the show really is it's news analysis. We are interested in sort of getting under the hood of the headlines and the issues that affect us.
Maddie, do you want anyone else to introduce themselves?
Oh yeah, let's have everybody who just popped in maybe say your name, pronouns, and favorite ice cream flavor. We'll start with you.
I'm Walton. The American Dream.
That's
That's the winner.
Cherry Garcia, 3-2.
Yeah, so 84 to 2. I wasn't.
Oh. We've got it recorded.
Francesca, did you? Oh, you did. Sorry, I
That's fine.
apologize.
Yeah. So please jump in if you have any questions. But my first question, just to start us off, one of my first reporting jobs was as a copy. I was not good at it. About a year into it, I became a copy editor, and I wasn't much of a reporter after that ever again. So most of my career was as a copy editor. But as a beat reporter, on the copy in particular, I know that the issue of police probably interests everybody in the room. I had trouble even back then, kind of coming to grips with dealing with people I wasn't necessarily in tune with, but needed them to get information out of it. Needed to cover, you know, on a regular basis. So maybe can you tell us, and I'm sure y'all are going to have to talk to police officers or police people at some point and get information. Could we launch in on how did you get in so well and do your job so well 10 years at the Journal? So much so that it's kind of been your go-to since.
Boy, that's complicated. I mean, somewhere along the line, the beat changed, my job changed, and that's because, you know, I think I was observant. Yeah, I don't know that I got in well. I don't think I ever got in well.
But you got in well enough to get the information into your job.
I did. So I mean,
So it's kind of a tightrope walk. I'm just asking about what would that be about?
I mean, I started by chasing crime, right? Which is what the Journal wanted me to do, to sort of write about what the police did in Albuquerque at night, which is, as everyone who lives here knows, different from what happens in Albuquerque during the day. So I wrote a lot about crime. I wrote a lot about, you know, arrests that the police made, trends and burglaries and that kind of thing. And pretty early in my career at the Journal, I want to say things started to shift really. I had started there at the end of 2003. By 2006 or 2007, it became pretty apparent to me that the cops were the story, and not like the work that they were allegedly doing to like arrest people and keep the city safe, because I didn't feel like they were keeping the city safe. I feel like felt like, and still feel like they were endangering the city. And, you know, very early on, I started to look at statistics and learned that the police here, you know, shot more people per capita than any other place in the country. So yeah, I started to focus on them instead of the job that they were doing. In terms of like getting information early on, I think I'm a pretty outgoing, curious person, and things were very different back then. They didn't have, you know, so-called free speech zones where you couldn't get near crime scenes and stuff like that. You could get really like in there and close. They weren't as insular and walled off as they are now. So I got to know the people who I thought were doing interesting things, right? The homicide detectives, the homicide sergeant, the crimes against children detectives. Those were the kinds of cases that I thought were important to write about. So I got to know the people who worked on those kinds of cases, and I had kind of pretty direct access to do that. And then like in terms of, and I know we're going to get to like source development, I've got a bunch of notes which I'm just going to throw out.
Yeah.
And at some point, like we should just talk about what a beat is, but to get back to what I was doing, the other thing that I used to do, because I knew that I did need to be able to talk to people who worked on the police department, I used to go, so the police union meets once a month at the Moose Lodge down off of Edith. I would go and park my car outside the Moose Lodge on the evenings when they were having their union meetings. I'd wait for them to come out. Back then, 400 or 500 people went to those meetings. I'd go down there with a stack of business cards like that and go try to hand a business card to every person who walked out of the meeting. And if 500 of them walked out and I approached 250 of them, 246 of them told me to go fuck myself. And the other 4 would take my business card and would start to call me and tell me, hey, this thing happened that you might be interested in. That thing happened that you might be interested in. And later on, when I started to become more interested in police violence, excessive use of force, and constitutional violations, some of those people turned into my sources, people who took incredible risks for their jobs to tell me things that the police department and the mayor did not want me or the public to know. So we'll talk some more about how source development works, but that was one thing I did. You know, I made myself like super present. I was there every time they had a news conference. I was there when they made announcements. I was there on the scene when they shot somebody. I was there on the scene when one of them got shot. So I wanted them to see my face and to know that, hey, this is my job. I'm going to be here whether you like it or not. That is how I started to develop, I think. I'm trying to answer your question as you are best I can. That's how I sort of started to develop that beat. And then as I did it more, I became more interested again in the way they were doing their jobs or not doing their jobs, and how that matched up with their own policies, how that matched up with the Constitution, how that matched up with the way communities here felt about the way they were being policed. So I think one way to sort of describe what happened over time is, in some way, I was sort of radicalized to believe that all governments lie, and my job really was to hold them accountable, and to do that, to try to report, and this is something I still think is incredibly important, to report from the perspective of the governed instead of the perspective of power, which I think is really different from the way most local media do it, and a lot of national media too. Too much of what we see, I think, is told from the perspective of power and not from the perspective of people who are subject to systems of oppression and things like that. So,
and what that's another thing that I find interesting is we see it on the national level, especially with political reporting, reporting of Congress and political activity races, where it seems to me, this has been going on for a long time, that a lot of the stories that you see written are done, we talk about the governed versus the people who are governing. That you see stories that are written to appease their sources. The people in power. So that reporters retain their access to power. So again, it's kind of walking a tightrope where you want access to these people because you want to get the story, but you don't want to necessarily be their friend or serve them with certain types of reporting. Is that similar to what you were trying to do with cultivating some police officers, but not appeasing the powerful?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was pretty turned off by access journalism from the very beginning, from when you and I knew each other here. It was never my style. I mean, in addition to not writing for official sources or writing for power, I also feel like it's incredibly important to not write for any kind of source, right? My constituents are the people who read and listen to and watch my stories, not the people who give me information and not the people I'm reporting about. That's my thought on how that is supposed to work. I guess it is a little bit of a tightrope. Again, over time, my sources, in particular, police sources, were folks who did that job, although the system itself is a mess, tried to do that job sort of for the right reasons. And I would get phone calls from cops who saw like bad things happen, who saw the guys they worked alongside do something wrong, or, you know, drop a gun next to somebody they just shot, or, you know, beat the hell out of a homeless person in the international district just because they could. So I would get calls from people who didn't like that, didn't want to work alongside folks like that. So those were the kinds of sources that I tried to cultivate. Over time, I mean, I've battled and had a really difficult time getting to do the last part of the job, which to me is I go out and I report my story and I gather my facts and I get my documents and I do my fact checking and all that. And often there are findings in those stories. Somebody did something wrong, right? There's a power differential that I discovered and I'm going to report. So then I got to take that to the people who did it or the people responsible for the people who did it and say, hey, I want to ask about this. I want to do an interview about this. Increasingly, we don't get an opportunity to do that part of the job anymore because they are walled off. They don't have to talk to us. The news media are no longer the gatekeepers or the, you know, only purveyors of information. Tim Keller has his own YouTube channel and a massive team of spokesliers who make way more money than any of us who do his thing, right? So they don't need us anymore in the way that they did when I started doing this. So that makes it difficult to do that last part of the job. So like, I do need some access because I want to ask you why the hell this happened. Sometimes we get that opportunity. And I think the best way I know to do that, and have always tried my whole career, is to be fair, to make sure that the people I'm reporting on aren't surprised by something that I've written or a television piece that I've made. I don't want anybody to be surprised. I want them to know what I'm saying and give them an opportunity to respond. There's a difference between fairness and objectivity, and we can have that conversation if y'all want. But yeah, I've always tried to be fair. And so I think one thing that's sort of weird and unique and a little different about me is I've done the same thing in the same place for a couple of decades. So I'm a pretty known quantity at this point, but now when I was a younger reporter, I think it was a little bit easier for me to navigate and to get that access. But you're right about political reporting, horse-race journalism when it comes to elections and that sort of stuff. That's not what I do. And it's not ever what I've done. And for a number of reasons. Number one, I don't think it serves the people who I mentioned earlier, my constituents. I don't think it serves like a healthy society. And also it's not fun if you're not doing this to, you know, press on some buttons. I think you're probably in the wrong job. For me, I have, since I was a little tiny kid, had a pathological problem with authority. And this is a way for me to get to exorcise that, right? To get to do that in a way that's legal. Although, reporting unfortunately is becoming increasingly criminalized in this country. But yeah, that's the way that I've always tried to approach the job. I don't think every journalist does. Also, the older I get, the softer I get in terms of understanding that there are a lot of different forms and kinds of journalism, but I've got a particular way that I think suits me and I think suits the American experiment, for lack of a better way to describe it than like it should be.
I know it's early in the semester and you guys are sort of getting feet under you in some ways. But please, jump in. Does anybody have any immediate questions right now, just about what you're covering, how you're covering it, what it's like to approach, sources?
Remind me your name?
Marcella,
Marcella.
I cover a meet from my hometown paper, for our mining district, so I cover like the city council meetings and that sort of thing. I was reached out to cover like this meeting of like homeowners who were worried about the neighborhood and explicitly didn't want cops to come. And so when I showed up and the cop showed up too, and he seemed like, he was trying to be friendly with me. I was trying to keep my distance, but it's like, how do you navigate that? Because then when they saw that, they were like, oh, I think it's best to keep you. Which is like,
The homeowner said it was best if
Yeah.
you leave.
yeah,
Did you stay?
I didn't, because it was private property.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I was like,
And not a public meeting.
no, not a public.
Yeah.
But they kicked the police chief too. So I was like, how do you navigate that? Cause I don't wanna, like, I'm not friends with the police chief. I just, so how does that?
I think it's okay to let that person be friendly, right? Just because we have this job doesn't mean that, we're humans first, I would say.
Yeah.
Journalists second, so I don't think there's any reason to be a jerk to somebody. I think it's perfectly okay for the police chief to come up and talk to you. He also needs to understand like what you want.
Yeah.
Right, so if you say something, buddy, it's on the record, That's the way I feel, and we could talk more about that later too. I think there's a bunch of different kinds of like power analysis in terms of the way we treat people as journalists, but that guy's a police chief. He only gets to go off the record and say something to you if you agree to that condition, right? So he needs to understand what you are, and again, it's perfectly acceptable as far as I'm concerned. Be nice to people. I try to be nice to people. I want to be a nice person. I think that's fine. And at the end of the day, like when they were in the process of kicking you out, I think I would have made a case for like, y'all invited me here.
Yeah.
Maybe start with that. And explain like, I want to tell your story. I have an interest and my readers have an interest in understanding your opposition to what's happening. So caveat emptor, right? Kick me out at your own risk. But in terms of navigating those relationships, I think that, right, be a human first, be nice, but one of the most important things you can ever be as a reporter is honest, right? Everyone should know like what the deal is, I mean, it's like the old parable about the snake, right? Where the snake is crawling along next to the guy. Hey, pick me up, I swear I won't bite you, I swear I won't bite you. And then the guy picks up the snake. Hey, you bit me. Well, yeah, I'm a snake. You think I was, right? So I think it's important for people to always understand like what the role of the journalist is. And then, it's perfectly okay to be respectful, even with people you disagree with ideologically and other ways. So I don't know if that answers your question, like how you navigate
maybe
that.
kind of like then the month, this was the Monday after they had their council meeting next year to give this report, and so he tried to come out and be like, oh, they kicked you out of the meeting too, and I was like, kind of awkwardly trying to handle that. Like, it's not really your business, is it?
That's cool. I mean, that's okay too, right? I mean, and there's lots of awkwardness in doing this, right? Embrace that. You gotta lean into that. It's not a comfortable thing to do, right? It's a weird job, and that if you sort of do it the way I do it, the only way that you're doing it well is if everyone's mad at you, right? And that's a awkward position to be in. But yeah, it sounds like you handled it quite well. It isn't any of this business that you got kicked out of the meeting too. But again, right, you don't have to like totally stiff arm the guy. It's like, you can do all of this, but again, you need to understand like what I am, and one day you might need to interview that police chief. So like being a human being might give you an opportunity to go and do that, but that doesn't mean that you're not there to deliver his message ever, right? You're there to serve.
I was gonna point that out too, but you may interact with that person down the road in the story. And You want them to think that you're being fair with them at all times. I knew Jeff when he worked here. I was the writing coach, and he was never a shy person, ever since I worked. I was a shy person when I was writing. I was starting out as a reporter. Did anybody here struggle with being shy or not feeling like you're bold enough to just approach people and interview them and get a story? Okay, you might be too shy to raise your hand. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what you struggle with, or what you'd like to be able to do as a reporter, a young reporter?
I don't know, approaching random people is kind of scary, but I'm trying to get better at it.
Okay. Do you talk to others about that, or is there anything you work on, or does anybody have advice?
I don't know.
I guess like my biggest thing is like approaching the stores and like just kind of like being like, oh, like I would really love to interview you, but also it's kind of hard like on my end, like I don't want to make you feel like you have to, but also like I really would like you to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that, right? When you approach someone, you could say that like, you're not under any kind of obligations to talk to me. At the same time, I'm really interested, and I think my readers would be too, in what it is you have to say or what it is you do, right? So I think like, again, that goes back to like honesty and a little bit of vulnerability, right? I tend to be a little bit of an oversharer, and I don't do that with sources. But I do think a little bit of humanity and vulnerability is good. It's perfectly okay to remind people you don't have to do this, you know, but didn't tell them, like, and be honest about why you want to talk to them. You think they're interesting. And then in terms of like trying to push through, right? Like getting over the awkwardness of approaching somebody. I think you just do that a bunch of times. I gotta say, like walking up to try to talk to somebody who doesn't like my reporting, or I'm gonna ask them about something that's really gnarly, it's still super awkward for me. I've done it for a long time, and I'm a massive extrovert. And I've done it so many times, but still there's just that like thing in the pit of your stomach that's like, oh man, I don't want to do this. I just want to go home and pet my dog. So you just do it anyway, right? And that's what I've kind of always done. And then really try to keep at the front of your mind that it's not an interpersonal interaction per se. This is what you do, and like we try to remember who you serve and the purpose of why you're walking up to somebody awkwardly to try to have a conversation that you don't necessarily want to have, and maybe they don't. That's the best thing. Like I said, it's still weird for me.
Jeff mentioned this earlier, but people do want to tell their stories. They do want to. There is something I think flattering about somebody coming up to them and saying, "I want to tell your story," and put it in the newspaper, or put it online, or do something with it. We want to, you know. Not that you're necessarily going to be their PR person, you're going to write what they want. And depending on if it's more of a feature story or more of a part news story. But people still, I think, more often than not, correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been on the journalist for a long time, but people do want to tell their story.
Some do, some don't, right? I mean, I can remember that, like in my early days as a cops reporter, you know, a lot of times I was calling someone or knocking on someone's door on the worst day of their life. You know, they had just lost a family member in a car wreck or to police violence or whatever that might be. And again, you have to lead with your humanity in those kinds of instances. And sometimes it's crystal clear from the very beginning, this person doesn't want to talk. And if that's the case, you got to go. Other times, and you just have to feel that, right? And it's like a muscle you develop over time where it's maybe this person does want to talk, maybe this person doesn't want to talk. And I will also say this profession has a super, super gnarly history of being incredibly exploitive. So that's a thing to pay attention to and to watch out for. I don't want ever to exploit someone for a story. That is a really, really shitty thing to do to someone. So there's a balance in all of that as well. But yeah, like I said, like trying to talk to someone when this awful thing has happened, there are a bunch of things that come with that. And it's not always awful. Sometimes you want to tell a story of someone who did something well or overcame something. They don't always want to talk either. And you just have to feel that. And sometimes it ends up being this incredibly lovely, cathartic sort of experience where somebody really, really did want to talk, and they didn't know it. And then you get to be there to like be on the other end of that, to witness that, right? A lot of journalism is witness, which is a blessing, a really beautiful thing to get to do. Other times people are not interested in doing that at all. And like I can remember like horrific murder cases and going to try to talk to folks, and they wanted to talk to somebody, anybody but like the cops, you know, so I got to be there for that and to witness that. And I will also just say that, you know, if you're reporting on things that are really difficult, we're not trained mental health professionals. So often you end up as like the receptacle for a lot of really difficult stuff, right? So a lot of secondary and tertiary trauma comes with the job too. So you got to take care of yourself. Your therapist should be on speed dial. And you should have a good, close group of other journalists and you can share that stuff. And vulnerability in those spaces is really important too. Like, you know, a lot of my best friends are reporters, editors, people who've been through a lot of the same kind of things that I have. And, you know, that's always been the case. That was the case starting when I was at the Lobo. Those who are working here, we had a really wild bunch of people who were here at the time I was here, but we were close and we shared those kinds of things. There is something really lovely in that too, like a real shared sense of purpose and mission, and we're in this together and that kind of thing. But yeah, sometimes people want to talk, sometimes people don't want to talk, and you gotta feel that.
But calling somebody whose loved one has died was the scariest thing to me. And I was shocked how often people would just welcome me into their home and show me pictures and they just open up. It's a really scary thing for you to do, but they really do want to tell the story. It's 12:40 already, so we're well into this. So if you have questions, get them in now. I'm going to also give Jeff the opportunity to sample his notebook to make sure he covers some of the things. Jump in. Jeff's got more to talk about too.
I would way rather answer questions than just like go through my notebook or any of that. So if anybody wants that. I mean, if we want to do basics, talk about what a beat is, what a source is. This is your all's time. No one wants to ask the question. Okay. So I think I've covered a good bit of this already, so I just can't help myself but talk. Well, maybe the source thing, right? I did talk some about cultivating sources. There are a lot of different kinds of sources, right? There are official sources. That's the mayor, that's the governor, that's the police chief, that's the elected state representative or senator, that's Martin Heinrich. Those are official sources. Also, the spoke flyers are official sources. And those are folks who, from my perspective at least, don't get to tell you things off the record. If you're talking to me, my job is to tell stories. I don't want to bullshit with you. I don't want to hear about, you know, your agenda or any of that. If you say something to me, I get to use it. That's just how that goes. Oftentimes folks in power will try to do the whole retroactive off the record thing. And maybe we should start with some basic definition of that.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So from the baseline, like the resting face of the interaction between a journalist and anybody else, that it's on the record. That means that I can use your name, your job title, and everything you tell me in a story that I am making. So that's where it starts. That is the default position for an interaction between a journalist and someone else. Next is sort of like an on background thing, which is a little bit gray, but that is someone is telling you something that can inform your story. You can use what they've told you to go and find the information in a more official way, whether that's through a document or through another person who is empowered or allowed to speak. So you can use the information, but you can't use the person's sort of name and job title. And then
they're kind of leading into.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, hey, did you hear about this? You might want to send a records request for this report or this data analysis or whatever. So those are sort of background sources. And then there are off the record sources. And those are folks who are telling you something that you can't use, but it's to inform you. about something that might be happening. But you can't use any of that information to go and ask for things. You can use it sort of for your own purposes to think of a way to go and find the information that might get you the story that you're trying to tell. And so
why do you use those different levels of?
well, I mean, let's start with the off the record, right? These are people who are often in vulnerable positions, whether that's a life circumstance or their job, and they're telling you something that brings a risk to them. So your primary responsibility at that point is to protect the identity of that person, no matter what that takes. And that's really hard to do in the digital age. If you get to the point where you're doing some more like investigative or accountability reporting, you should have an encrypted email account, you should use an encrypted text messaging app, all of those things, because it's easier now to sort of discover journalist sources than it's ever been. But it's a vulnerability, right? It's someone who is in a vulnerable position, and you don't want to further jeopardize that person's life circumstance for their job. You use the background situation, because again, maybe this is someone who works as a legislative staffer. They work for the legislative finance committee, right? And they are not allowed to speak to journalists on the record and be quoted in stories. But these are folks who do talk to lots of reporters. Kind of everybody knows it happens. And they're in a little bit less vulnerable of a position, but at the same time, you can't quote them. And then everybody else is, again, default on the record. And if somebody ever says, hey, what I'm about to say is off the record, you need to stop that person cold in their tracks right there and have a conversation. Why do you want to go off the record? Explain to me why you should be off the record. And they're not off the record until you say they are, right? Tim Keller doesn't get to tell you when it's time to go off the record. That's not how that works. And again, he's the mayor as far as I'm concerned. He never gets to go off the record. So that's kind of how those conditions work. And again, it really works on sort of a power analysis. Are you talking to someone who has power? Are you talking to someone who has a little bit of power? Are you talking to someone who has no power? Because often you are talking to folks who aren't used to speaking to the press, right? So they don't understand the difference between on the record, off the record, on background. So those are important definitions to sort of get out there, right? Anyway, I was kind of going through the list of different kinds of sources. Anything or anyone can be a source. It doesn't have to be a human source. Documents are often sources. We have a couple of laws, one at the state level called the Inspection of Public Records Act, which is the state transparency law that allows you access and anyone access. You're not special because you're journalists, but it allows you access to records, documents, videos. It's how we get like police body camera video. Those videos are subject to our public records laws. You are entitled to them. So those are sources of information too, right? They're not human beings. They might be documents, pieces of video, whatever. Those are also sources. Your friends and family are sources too, right? A good journalist has their eyes open, their ears open all the time, right? You're paying attention to conversations around the dinner table. You're paying attention to conversations at concerts, at the bar, to have a beer. You're paying attention when you're out in the community, and your eyes are a really good source of information too. So almost anything can be a source. One other classification of like documents, videos and stuff are the leaked documents, videos. They're things you might not necessarily have access to through the records law, but that someone hands you like confidentially. Here is this thing that no one is supposed to see.
What about following social media? I mean, is that ways to cultivate sources?
I guess. Can't I just, I mean, I still have a Twitter account. Am I supposed to call it X now? I don't know. I left Facebook in 2010. It's one of the smartest decisions I've ever made. I think it's toxic. I think it's really bad for a lot of the conversations that we're trying to have now. At the same time, there is a value in trying to gather a pulse, but I mean, it's all based on algorithms now. It's not real. I do have to be in some of these spaces as a result of my job. Yeah, that's complicated for me. I mean, they used to be different, and that crowdsourcing was something that you could use them for. I think you can still, to some degree, but you're sort of an open invitation to trolls, people who just want to tell you that everything you do is fake. You know, you want to write a story about something that's happening with student government, and hey, anybody know about X, Y, and Z? RIP or mentions as far as so I don't know. I have a complicated relationship with social media. also said, 49 years old, and I have ways of doing this, in which I am not required to do that anymore. So at the same time, you want people to see what you make, right? It's a lot of what we do is just scream at the rain. You got to go find people where they are. Like I said, I oversee and produce a television program that not very many people watch. So we have to be in places where people can see them. We have to chop those shows into bits and put them out on YouTube in smaller, more digestible bites where people can like sort of go buffet style, what I make, right? And I mean, newspapers, we used to like take all the information we could gather. I worked at daily newspapers. All the information we could gather on a given day, we'd throw it on a bunch of dead trees and you'd toss it in your driveway. And then you would go out and get that, which is a bundling exercise. No one consumes recycling. There just aren't very many people who are, even online, people aren't like homepage visitors. People don't go to abqjournal.com and see what's up. They see individual a la carte versions of these things. And social media is a way to try to get people to see what you did. It's not just an ego thing, right? I'm not making this so that I can, thump my chest. I'm making this because I think it's valuable. I think that the second I start to believe that an informed electorate doesn't make better decisions at the ballot box, then I should totally quit and go like do marketing for a week, not a week.
What did you cover?
Cops.
You did some student government.
I did do some student
Can you talk
government.
a little bit about covering student government?
Sure. I mean, I think it's good. Everything about working here is sort of a dress rehearsal or a practice run for, going and reporting on city councils or the state legislature. At the same time, I think that y'all probably hear that way too much. Oh, it's a learning lab and all that. It also matters. People read the Daily Lobo. I still read the Daily Lobo all the time. And I care about what's happening in student government. And maybe that's just because I'm a sick person or whatever, and I used to do that myself, but it does actually matter. And accuracy still does actually matter. It's really important that you try to take the job seriously. And the weird thing about journalism is you can't make mistakes, but we do. Mistakes happen. And so reporting on student government back then was a little bit different, and some of it's just the same, right? You see these patterns kind of repeat over and over and over again, where there were efforts to defund Scribendi and defund, best student essays, defund the Daily Lobo when I was here. And that stuff is still going on, where there are all these fights about how to do that. So I had to report on some of that. And then I thought I wanted to be a sports writer. I moved here. I'm a golfer, right? And I was a writer way before I was a journalist. I thought I wanted to be a golfer. And I got sold a bill of goods to come to the University of New Mexico. The journalism program was in great shape, and we were going to have sports writing classes. So I came here. I went to work here like the day I got on campus. And 6 weeks after I got here, the journalism department lost its accreditation. Right? So we were writing stories in the Daily Lobo at that time, nasty stories about the department, about our professors. They were on the front page of the newspaper. We would have to go and sit in their classes with these stories on the front page of the newspaper. Super awkward, but very much gave me, my taste for like the adversarial nature of doing this. And I guess other stuff that I did while I was here, I reported quite a bit on the hospital and like my really first investigative reporting is a really weird phrase. I think all journalism should be investigative in nature, but I investigated a bunch of allegations of Medicaid billing fraud at the pain clinic at UNM Hospital. And I got a doctor ripped out of his job. He was prosecuted by the Justice Department for Medicaid fraud. And that was kind of the thing that made me really want to go and expose wrongdoing, right? It's the pain clinic. And what this guy was doing was people who were in severe pain, and this is before anybody knew the phrase opioid crisis. He was scheduling people for visits, not having them come in to address their pain, billing their insurance companies, billing Medicaid, and prescribing like really hardcore opioids to these folks who were in dire life situations. And I met some of those people. And I got to tell their stories, and I saw like, what this doctor and what the system at the hospital did to people. And that really radicalized me as well, and sort of hardened me against or toward the idea that, you know, a lot of the systems in American democracy are designed as oppressive. So that was another thing that I paid really close attention to while I was here, the student paper, and I loved my time here. And I would not be the person, and certainly not the journalist I am now without my time at the Daily Logo. So, oh yeah, dude.
So how did you find that, the hospital story? I mean.
Yeah, I was covering an award ceremony at Zimmerman Library. Yeah, I was, speaking of sources, right? I was covering an award ceremony at Zimmerman Library, which I didn't want to be covering. I wanted to be doing all the other stuff. And there was a person who was there who saw that I worked for the Daily Logo and approached me and said, "Can we talk outside?" And this person told me that there was Medicaid fraud happening, that there was a cover-up happening, all the way up to the chancellor, well, I guess the vice president at the time for health sciences. So I got a tip. Somebody just rolled up, was like, "Hey, you're a reporter. I tried to tell someone at the Albuquerque Journalist, they didn't give a shit. So are you interested?"
And how did you then figure out what to do next?
I used the resources in my life. My mother worked in healthcare for many, many, many years. I started there. "Hey mom, this person told me this, what is that?" So I started to learn like the language and the lay of the land, like, how would you do that? How do you do that? How do you commit fraud in that fashion? And I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it's a thing called upcode. So when a doctor bills for services, bills Medicaid, bills you, bills your insurance company, they have to enter a code. And what they did, please.
Sorry, so in your case, would that make your mom like a source?
Yeah.
You kind of got.
Hell
like,
yeah.
information
Yeah.
from her?
My mom was definitely, no, I did not quote her. My mom was definitely a source, but I didn't know anything about any of this, right? And I knew my mom did. So she helped me understand the galaxy in which this stuff existed. Then I started to use the public records law. This guy named Bob Johnson, who was the co-founder of the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government, who helped me fight to get some of the records that I needed to prove these claims up. And then I started to develop sources. I called everybody, including, because I didn't know what I was doing, I called up one of the vice presidents who did the dirt. I was like, "Hey, can you tell me about this?" And she hung up on me real fast, right? So then I really learned a lot about sources then. Your best sources are not the people with the power, they're the people we report on, right? Your best sources are the worker bees, the people that, and they know everything, right? Administrative assistants, doctors, physicians assistants, stuff like that. But Davin, to your point, it started with just a human source tip from somebody I had never met before in my life, who, by the way, is a source to this day. And so is this person's son, right? Which is right? Like that person's still a source, that person's son, who also works in healthcare. So that's how I found it. And it turned into, you know, I go back and read those stories. They're a little cringy in terms of the way they were presented. And like, we use some anonymous sources in those stories. Like the way we characterize the sources, the attribution on the lead is like, reliable sources have told the Daily Logo. And it's like, my God, how many times do you read All the President's Men and then try to like, duplicate the way they, or like the Daily Logo has learned, you know what I mean? Stuff like that.
Did you have a follow-up?
No, I'm good.
Okay, cool.
And at the very beginning, Jeff said something about talking to police officers and handing out his card. What's the equivalent of that? You guys don't have business cards, do you?
I would do that. We can. I just cut
We
up.
haven't done it yet, but.
Do you think that's a good idea, or
I do.
to have a physical
Totally.
card?
I don't have any from PBS yet. I got a stack of business cards from other news organizations, but those wouldn't do anybody any good. I'll have business cards soon, and I totally still believe, even in the digital age, for sure.
If anything, they're just fun to put in the wallet.
Totally. And my mom likes them. My mom's got a stack of business cards from old previous news organizations.
I mean, there's even digital cards, too,
Totally.
if you didn't wanna have to prefer them.
Oh, yeah, I'm thinking you just kind of like,
Trees, right? I don't work in newspapers.
kind of, in some way, you just put your phones up against each other.
Yeah, and it just like sends you the business card with the phone number and
Yeah.
everything.
I do think that's worthwhile, right? And I can't stress enough, like being in the world. The world is a strange place now, especially you know, with COVID cases going back up and all of that, but journalism was really, really, really hard to. By then, most of my focus was reporting on prisons and conditions inside prisons and the horrors that were being visited on people while they were incarcerated. And it was incredibly difficult to report on those things without people to walk in prison. You need to be able to see stuff. The people you're reporting on and the people who are telling you things need to be able to see your face, right? Just an online profile or a LinkedIn profile or an email address. There's something that's incredibly like dehumanizing about that. I do think that like being there, I mentioned witnessing earlier, and you can certainly witness things online. You can watch them burn zozobra online, but it's not the same thing as being there and smelling that and inhaling a bit of the smoke.
I would say that your generation is really comfortable doing things virtually. And I think there is really something to be said by being that person who shows up in person to things. I think it would give you an edge. On the other hand, when I was starting out as a reporter, I would love to have been able to text people. That would have been awesome. So it is, I think, 1 o'clock. Any last second questions before you guys put a newspaper together? Stephanie, closing thoughts? I kind of stepped on it before. It would have been a nice place to end. Well, just how wonderful it was.
Oh, yeah, this, right? I mean, I'm not, look, Gwyneth Dolan, who I'm free ball had class with, and for some of you, those of you who are journalists and majors, I love her. She's one of my best friends. She's a correspondent who works for me now, which is super crazy. And I think she's doing a great job, and I think the department is on its way toward doing great things. There were good professors here when I was here too, but I learned everything by doing this. This is how you learn the thing. You have to do the thing to learn the thing. A classroom is not a place to learn how to do it. So do this. Do both. Go to classes and graduate. I did not.
And then talk to Maddie about what kind of topics you want to cover going forward.
We can do another Kahoot poll if you guys are into that.
Yeah, because I'm working on, we have talked, and I'm working on, once for the next 2 months. But please, if there's something really specific that you want, that would be helpful. I would love that. I could put that together like that. And so, otherwise we're gonna work with that kind of general list that we have so far. But we'd love to just bug you once a month and try to give you something that you guys would find.
You can hit me up too. I'll write my email address on the Blackboard, and I do have a Twitter. I keep trying to say Twitter. I have an X account. Am I Xing now? Is that what you do? Or they call it posting?
To be very blunt.
Post,
Are you CJ Proctor?
at CJ Proctor 74. It's my account, and I'll write my email address up there. And I'm seriously super wide open to answer any and all questions. Or if you're having trouble with records stuff, if you get to that point, you can hit me up. I'm pretty good at that. And it's important to me. And also there's not anything that I would not do for these two and for the Daily Logo, because this is why I am me. So I'll write my email address up there. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, y'all.